All right, hello, you guys. Today we're going to be talking about the actual fighting of the war with World War I. So we're going to not get too much into like specific battles and military history with this. We're going to be focusing more on like what kind of fighting was going on and what were kind of the effects of that fighting. This lecture is split into two parts. So this first part is going to kind of talk about the start of the war. The second part is going to talk about the war spreading to other parts of the world. And the second part, just to warn you, was recorded last year, right after spring break when we first went online. So it's the first lecture I ever recorded. The first 5 minutes you can completely skip of that because it's just instructions that are not relevant to you. If there are any instructions on there that talk about like, we're doing this tomorrow, or you need to do this, this, and that, you can ignore that. It's just relevant to people who were in my class a year ago. So yeah, so today we're looking at the fighting of the war. So let's get started. So we've seen this before, the causes of the war, this idea of mania, militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination. So we have kind of this, this powder keg, this fire waiting to be lit, lots of different factors that are kind of ratcheting up tension in Europe and making it so that when you have this inciting incident of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, that means that, you know, the entire continent gets kind of dragged into the war. We have this assassination happening. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is killed by a Serbian nationalist. And even though he was not associated with the Serbian government, the Austrians still blame Serbia for the murders. And they use this as an excuse to punish Serbia. They send them an ultimatum with just a laundry list of demands. Many of them are just nearly impossible for the Serbians to actually fulfill. But Serbia did know that if they refused Austria's demands, they would be going to war, and that they didn't have a very large chance of winning a war with Austria. And so they did agree to most of Austria's demands. They wanted to avoid war as much as possible. So any of their demands that were kind of reasonable, Serbia agreed to. However, Austria was not willing to negotiate, not willing to take any of their demands off of the list. And so they declared war. And because of the alliance system that was already set up, the rest of Europe kind of gets dragged into the war with them. So Austria had declared war on Serbia. And that really could have been the end of it. They could have, crushed Serbia between their boot heel, and it all would have been over, except that Serbia was allied with Russia. So Russia begins moving its troops towards the Austrian border in response to Austria's declaration of war against Serbia. They also anticipate that that Germany will probably join Austria if Austria goes to war with them, and so they also start moving troops towards the German border. So Russia is the first country to mobilize their troops against a major power. However, they don't actually declare war. Germany is the first country to declare war on a major power. Germany basically takes this movement of troops as an indication that Russia is going to attack them. And so they declare war on August 1st of 1914. So that becomes the first time that you have a major power declaring war on another major power. And this is kind of why Germany gets the blame, in part, for the war happening. So Russia and Germany are at war. Russia looks to their ally, France, to help them. They're expecting that France will declare war. However, before France even has a chance to do that, Germany just preemptively declares war on France. So again, Germany is the one declaring war, even though the expectation was that France would have done so anyway. And then Britain gets dragged into the war because Germany decides to go through Belgium to get to France. So there is a German-French border in the region of Alsace-Lorraine, but it's very well defended because, you know, France and Germany are not friends. And so Germany decides that it's going to be easier to go through Belgium and attack France along its Belgian border because it's less defended. And so they invade Belgium, but Great Britain has made an agreement with Belgium that they will defend them if they're invaded, and so that drags Britain into the war again. So by mid-August of 1914, you have basically your two sides of the war. You have the central powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. They're later joined by Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. And then you have your allied powers of Britain, France, and Russia, who are also joined by Italy and Japan. And Italy, you may notice, was part of the Triple Alliance, so they had been allied with Austria-Hungary and Germany, but they felt that Germany was unjustly starting the war. They felt like Germany was at fault, and so they actually changed sides and fought for the Allies instead of the Central Powers. So we have this start of the war, and Germany has a plan. Germany was going to be facing war on two fronts, France on the western side, Russia on the eastern side. And so they need to come up with a plan to address that issue because they don't really have the resources to fight a war on both sides and win. So they come up with what is known as the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan called for attacking and defeating France first, and then rushing to then attack and defeat Russia in the east. So basically, they're going to do it one at a time, and they're just hoping that they'll defeat France quickly so that they can go and face Russia. They felt that this would probably work because Russia was not nearly as industrialized as the rest of Europe at this point. They had started their industrialization much later, which meant that their supply lines were much slower. So they felt that Russia would be pretty slow to mobilize. And so they could defeat France, and then by the time that Russia had mobilized, they would be able to move their troops across the country to face Russia. However, defeating France took a lot longer than expected. The Germans lost a really important battle at the Battle of Marne, at the Marne River, where basically the war fell into a stalemate, and so they were not able to complete this Schlieffen Plan. Russia also mobilized a lot faster than they had been expecting, which was a problem for them as well. The expectation going in for a lot of people was that the war would be short. People were talking about that they would be home by Christmas. It started in August and they'd be home by Christmas. However, by October, November of 1914, it was pretty clear that this war was going to take a lot longer than people had anticipated. It had turned into a long and bloody stalemate. Especially on the Western Front, where, you know, the battle lines were drawn, and they stayed that way for years. Entire battles, thousands of soldiers would die, and the outcome of the battle would be the front line moving by maybe a mile. So this war was dragging on a lot longer than people had expected. What it turned into was trench warfare. So by 1915, the armies on the Western Front had dug miles and miles and miles of trenches to protect themselves from enemy fire. So they're kind of dug in. So it's protecting them from enemy fire, but it also makes it a lot harder for the front lines to advance or to move. So soldiers would fight from the trenches. Occasionally, people would go up out into no man's land, the area in between each side trenches, to try to attack the other side. But for the most part, you have kind of shooting and shelling and bombing happening from these trenches. And because of that, you have huge, huge losses of life for really small land gains. Thousands of people would die in a battle where the front line moved half a mile. Aside from, the constant warfare, life in the trenches was also just really awful on its own scale. They were muddy, they were rainy, they were full of rats. There was very little food or other supplies. People were kind of pretty tightly rationed, and what food they did get was, not, very interesting. Kind of canned food was pretty common. It was very cold. It was very hard to sleep because, people didn't stop fighting overnight. So there was always bombs going off. There were always guns firing. And so you could fall asleep and suddenly there's a bomb falling on you. And so people develop really terrible cases of PTSD as a result of this trench warfare. It's also really boring. You're fighting for your life, but it's also, intertwined with long stretches of boredom, of nothing happening. And so people coming back from the war talk about this state of mind that they fall into where they're bored, and then suddenly they're in this state of mortal terror, and then that's over and they're back to boredom. It's really very bad for people's mental health, and it's not surprising that many, many soldiers walked away from this war with a terrible case of PTSD, or as they called it at that time, shell shock or combat fatigue. This generation, you're Gen Z, I'm a millennial. This generation is called the Lost Generation because of their experience in World War I. Complicating matters were the new tools that were in play. So there was a lot of new technology that was being used in World War I for the first time. The problem though was that they have all this new technology, but they were using it the same way that they had before. They were kind of lining their armies up and kind of throwing them at each other. There wasn't any kind of change in military tactics to go along with the new technology that they had. Basically, that just meant that nothing much was happening and lots of people were dying. People had expected that there would be a really fast-moving war because of this new technology, but both sides had this technology, which meant that that wasn't really the case. Both sides had machine guns, they had poison gas, chlorine gas, armored tanks, larger artillery. And so basically all that this technology did was drive up the casualty numbers. Technology killed much greater numbers of people much more effectively, creating this huge, giant body count. Trench warfare was mostly used in the Western Front. The Eastern Front did see a little bit more movement. So the Eastern Front was mostly along the German and Russian border. It involved Russians and Serbs fighting against Germans and Austro-Hungarians. It was a bit more mobile than in the West. Germany manages to gain a lot of territory in Russia, actually, and they kind of send settlers into that territory even. However, it still had extremely high death tolls, and it still, ended up with stalemates pretty often. And so it became a much slower moving war than people had anticipated. So this is kind of the start of the war and the part of the war where it's really, Europeans fighting Europeans. Part 2 of the lecture is going to talk about other countries entering the war, and it'll talk about a lot of the consequences of the war, especially on the home front. The war was hard on the soldiers, but it was also hard on the people back home. So hard, in fact, that the Austro-Hungarian Empire actually dissolves as a result of the tensions that happen because people are unhappy with the way that the war is going. So you guys are going to go and watch part 2 and take notes.